Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
In the summer of 1940, less than a year after declaring war on the German aggressor, this country stood alone and on the very brink of defeat. The unthinkable had become reality. The British Army in France had been smashed, stripped of guns, tanks and equipment, its remnants snatched from the beaches of Dunkirk by the Royal Navy and the little ships. The German invasion force was poised and ready, and all that stood between Hitler and his dream of a victory salute here on the Horse Guards Parade were the will of the British people and the defeat by annihilation of the Royal Air Force. In what was to become known as the Battle of Britain, that victory was denied him. From July to the end of October, the battle raged both in the sky and on the ground. But on this very day, the 15th of September, it reached its climax. And so, 50 years on, those events which unquestionably shaped the course of world history are to be commemorated by some of those who made it all happen and we who inherited the fruits of their gallantry. In the forecourt of Buckingham Palace and around the Victoria Memorial now assembles one of the most distinguished parades ever mounted by the Royal Air Force. There are no less than 4 Queen's colours on parade and 17 squadron standards, together with their escorts, representing all the Battle of Britain squadrons still extant. In the van, led by the parade commander, Group Captain Joe French, the Royal Guard of Honour, found by the Queen's Colour Squadron of the RAF Regiment, custodians of the Queen's Colour of the Royal Air Force in the United Kingdom. Queen's Colour Squadron enters the forecourt. The 4 bands on parade are the Central Band of the Royal Air Force, the Band of the RAF College Cranwell, the RAF Western Band and the Royal Artillery Band. Contingents of the Royal Australian and Royal New Zealand Air Forces escort their respective Queen's colours, and the Royal Canadian Air Force is escorting number 401 Squadron Standard, remembered as number 1 Fighter Squadron RCAF in the Battle of Britain. Unarmed flights and contingents represent the other service and civilian arms significant in the battle. There are 600 veterans and their relatives here from the Commonwealth and overseas, and by no means least amongst them those gallant fighters from Poland and Czechoslovakia who escaped to continue their defiance after their own countries had been overrun. This then, the scene which awaits the arrival of Her Majesty the Queen and members of the royal family on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. With the Queen, Prince Philip, his uniform that of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Princess Margaret and the Duchess of York, Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, the Duke and Duchess of Kent, Princess Alexandra and her husband, Their Majesties the King and Queen of the Belgians, King Baudouin and Queen Fabiola, and Prince Bernhard and Princess Juliana of the Netherlands. And so the scene is set for the Flypast, 168 aircraft in close formation, equaling the number in the Queen's coronation Flypast. The Prime Minister, members of the government and opposition, a very distinguished gathering indeed in the VIP gallery. And so we await the largest flypast seen over London since the Second World War. It consists of 7 separate formations, each formation of up to 4 distinct elements, several of disparate aircraft types, and of the 71 accredited squadrons which served under fighter command during the Battle of Britain, all still flying fixed-wing aircraft are represented today, and that's 32 squadrons in all, plus the Red Arrows and the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and theirs is the honour of the lead. There are 5 Spitfires and 2 Hurricanes, led by the Air Officer Commanding Number 11 Group, Air Vice Marshal Bill Ratton, today's successor to that great New Zealander Keith Park, who commanded the group in 1940. Bill Ratton then in the leading and oldest Spitfire, it's a Mark II, the 2 Hurricanes abreast, behind him the Spitz outboard. Speed 180 knots, altitude 500 feet, and looking up at this formation with critical, if perhaps slightly moist eyes, some of those who flew those aircraft as the first of the few. And now closing their 1-minute gap at 210 knots and 2,000 feet, 3 big VC-10s from Bryce Norton, numbers 10 and 101 squadrons, and on their wingtips 2 Tornadoes of 13 Squadron from Honington. They're used to that. Tornadoes routinely refuel in flight from VC-10 tankers. Next, the workhorses, 4 Hercules of 242 ACU Lynham, led by the CO Wing Commander Pete Bedford. The Lossiemouth Maritime element, 2 Buccaneers of 12 Squadron flanked the lead Nimrod, 2 more from 208 Squadron on the second. Now a mixed bag, 4 Canberras from 331 at Whitton, and 2 BAE 125s from 32 Squadron at Northolt, the government communication flight. And the executive jets not easy to hold in formation with the world's first operational jet bomber, as the Duke of Edinburgh and the Chief of the Air Staff will observe. A planned 40-second gap, and then formation number 3. At 360 knots, the fighters. First 16 Tornadoes thundering in from Coningsby. 4 boxes of 4 in a box of boxes, and it doesn't do to feel claustrophobic in the middle of that little lot. 229 OCU, 65 and 29 Squadrons, the last box just back from the Gulf. Then the fighter trainers, 16 Hawks from Brawley and Chivenera in 4 squadrons, 79, 63, 234 and 151. And then 16 more Tornado F3s from Leaning, led by 25. Then Treble 1, the Great Black Arrows, 43 and 29 squadrons to starboard and in the tail. And finally the Phantom, 16 again from Lucas, Wattisham and Wildenrath, 5 squadrons there, 64, 92, 19, 74 and 56. The Phantoms being replaced by Tornadoes, but still very much in frontline service. Now the 4th formation, the strike aircraft. First 16 Tornado GR1s from Aria-Bruggen and Laarbruck in Germany, 17 and 16 Squadron. Next the Harriers, 12 GR5s led by number 3 from Gütersloh and 1 and 233 from Wittering. And from the Fleet Air Arm, 4 Sea Harriers from 899 at Yeovilton. Amongst them, Squadron leader Jeff Glover shot down in the Falklands War. Then the Honington Tornadoes, and then the Jaguars from Coltishall. And now, 50 seconds behind the Jaguars and closing down to 1,000 feet, the Red Arrows and their Hawks approaching the triumphant end of a particularly distinguished and busy season. But here's a sensational view as we go aboard the Lancaster. Squadron leader Colin Patterson, the officer in charge of the flight in every sense, and his co-pilot squadron leader Mike Chatterton at 750 feet, symbolically alone. It's 4 Merlins growling in at 150 knots. The memorial flight's pride and joy, City of Lincoln, representing the epic deeds of Bomber Command in the battle and throughout the war, described by that great man of British aviation, Sir George Edwards, as an aircraft designed by engineers and built by craftsmen and women for heroes to fly. And finally, having cut back from the lead to conclude the Flypast, the Spitfire and Hurricane, flown by the AOC 11 group and the station commander at Coningsby. And here they come to salute Her Majesty in the time-honored style of the fighter pilot. And so, after those moments of intense excitement, Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh, escorted by the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Peter Harding, now leave the balcony and descend to the palace forecourt for the traditional inspection of the Royal Guard of Honour, followed by a review from the palace Range Rover of all the units and contingents on parade. The armed flights with their colours and standards and their escorts occupy centre stage. The Royal Auxiliary Air Force with its Queen's colour. The right front markers are 43 and 41 squadrons, which flew Hurricanes and Spitfires respectively, now equipped with Tornado F3s and Jaguars at Lucas and Coltishall. The great 5 and 600s represented by the auxiliaries, for example, their friendly rivals 602 and 603 of Glasgow and Edinburgh, who later I knew well. The Royal Artillery Band here with its Old Comrades Association, in token of the hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and searchlights whose crews, both men and women, in many cases spent days on end without leaving their gun pits. And beside that group, the New Zealanders, with their Queen's colour, presented by Her Majesty in 1953, since then never before today paraded other than within its native shores. And note, the New Zealand WAAFs are armed. And on the far flank, the Royal Australian Air Force, still distinctive in their darker blue uniform, parade their Queen's colour. And to the left of centre, the Royal Canadian Air Force, with the squadron standard of what was their number 1 squadron, RCAF, which flew Hurricanes. The Chief of the Air Staff escorts Her Majesty from the Privy Purse door. The Royal Guard of Honour drawn up across the centre of the forecourt, found by the corps d'elite of the Royal Air Force on the ground. Its CO Squadron Leader Roger Booth leads to the Queen the fact that it is ready for her inspection. And at this point, we hear a piece of music specially commissioned for the occasion. Wing Commander Barry Hingley, their Senior Director of Music, conducts the Royal Air Force bands in the first public performance of Ron Goodwin's The 15th of September. The Queen's Colour Squadron, familiar, of course, with great occasions. But surely no parade even they have ever mounted has presented moments more proud than this, as the sovereign acknowledges her colour, of which they are the custodians, on this historic day. And further to mark this 50th anniversary, the squadron is mounting the Palace Guard for the current period of duty. The inspection of the Royal Guard of Honour concluded, Her Majesty will now review the remainder of the parade. Parade Commander Group Captain Joe French joins the Chief of the Air Staff in attendance, and His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh is escorted by Wing Commander Peter Storey. The first flight to be reviewed after the Range Rover has turned is a very distinguished one. Round comes the vehicle to drive back across the palace, and the Queen will see the representatives of the Royal Air Forces Association. Air Vice Marshal Sir Ivor Broome is the right marker, Group Captain the Right Honourable the Earl of Ilchester the left. Its national standard in the centre. Together with the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, the association cares for members of the service family in need and need their and our support. Next, the Royal Observer Corps with their banner, whose outpost supplemented the radar reports of enemy aircraft. Next to them, the RAF Volunteer Reserve, which provided countless aircrew during and after the battle. Numbers 1 and 3 squadrons, number 1 the oldest, formed in 1878 with balloons. The Royal Australian Air Force, with its Queen's colour behind it, 56 and Treble 1 squadrons. Then 17, 19, 54 and 74, all Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons. The Royal Canadian Air Force, whose aircrew served on so many squadrons as well as their own. 23 and 25, both flew Blenheims, now Tornadoes. The Royal New Zealand Air Force, an astonishing number of New Zealanders, distinguished themselves from Keith Park to Sheep Gilroy and Pathfinder Bennett and many others. 29, another Blenheim squadron is reviewed. 32 now based at Norfolk, the last Battle of Britain airfield still operation, and behind them 72 and 85. The Royal Auxiliary Air Force, the legendary and heroic amateurs, and behind them the representatives of the civilian services. And now the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh drive back for what will be for many an unforgettable experience. To the far right of the palace forecourt are assembled several hundred veterans of the Battle of Britain and their relatives, men and women of that broad diversity of background and experience who were in 1940, as they are today, the people of Britain. It is the kind of occasion from which we know both the Queen and the Duke derive as much pleasure as they bestow. It will be, if you will, a recollection of the visits made by the Queen's parents to airfields and squadrons, control rooms, hospitals and bomb sites at a time when the British people were probably more united than at any time in their history. Her Majesty is welcomed by Air Chief Marshal Sir Christopher Foxley Norris, chairman of the Battle of Britain Fighter Association, arguably the world's most exclusive and distinguished club. And its indefatigable secretary, Wing Commander Pat Hancock, stands alongside the chairman. And so memories are recalled and no doubt exchanged. But like all epic events, the facts of the Battle of Britain have become clouded in mythology. Typically, Sir Christopher Foxley Norris has cogent comment on the subject.
It is interesting that if you went up to the average man in the street and said, "Do you know anything about the Battle of Britain?" and he'd say, "Oh yes, a few dashing young English officers flying Spitfires defeated the Germans." They weren't as few as all that, you know. People are very surprised, but there were nearly 3,000 of our people in the battle. Not at the same time, never more than about 700 at one time, but 3,000 actually qualified. If they were dashing, they didn't last very long. They weren't all young by any means. A lot of them were, of course, but people like Douglas Bader, Sailor Milan, well over 30, and some of the Poles and Czechs were over 40. By no means all officers. People forget that 1/3 of the pilots in the Battle of Britain were NCOs. And in fact, some of the air crew in the fighter Blenheims and Defiance weren't even NCOs, they were airmen. And they weren't flying Spitfires. 2/3 of the aircraft flying were Hurricanes. Everybody's heard of the Spitfires. So dashing young officers and so on, that's a 100% inaccurate statement.
Sir Christopher Foxley Norris expressing the wit shared by all his colleagues amongst this group of very, very distinguished veterans, the company of whom Her Majesty is obviously enjoying. But even on royal occasions, in gatherings such as this, airmen talk inevitably of aeroplanes.
How did you compare the Spitfire with the Hurricane?
The Spitfire, as we all know, was faster, sleek-looking airplane, a beautiful airplane to fly. The Hurricane was heavier, a little slower, but of course could outturn the Spitfire and the 109. A superb gun platform, the Hurricane, could absorb a great deal of punishment. And I knew that because my airplanes seemed to get hit rather more often than I hit the Germans at that stage.
The 109 we found could outclimb us. It flew faster than us, but she could never outturn us. And it was turning that mattered in that sort of war.
The Hurricane was rock stable, quite easy to fly, not as fast as the 109, but in every other respect it was fully up to the job. You couldn't run away quite as quickly as you might like if you wanted to, and equally if 109 ran away from you, you couldn't catch it up.
I was hit in France earlier on, before the Battle of Britain, and the Hurricane just shrugged off the bullets through the fabric, which was a great advantage over an all-metal construction.
But the ladies and gentlemen whom Her Majesty is meeting were by no means all aircrew. To talk to any ex-pilot about the Battle of Britain, and he will pay tribute to the ground crews. They too are, of course, included in this distinguished gathering.
How did you enjoy taking care of a Spitfire?
Very much. You know, it was an intriguing challenge. You never knew what you were going to find any time an aircraft came back. And to get them ready in the mornings and between sorties for another sortie was really a test of one's skill.
Obviously, you were looking for battle damage every time it landed.
Not only for battle damage, but the correct functioning of all the controls. The elevators, the flaps, checking over the undercarriage to make sure there was no hydraulic leaks anywhere, looking in the cockpit and waggling the stick about, lowering the flaps, looking at the tyres.
You were there when Hornchurch was attacked?
Indeed, yes, and it was severely bombed on several occasions, both during the daytime and at night. And of course, everybody had to go down into the air raid shelters. Otherwise, you know, if you were killed, well, you were one airman less.
After the airfield had been bombed, did you, as a rigger, help filling in the holes?
Oh, yes, too true. Having got your aircraft serviceable, then you went out and filled in the holes. And, I mean, often aircraft would come back and just land, stop on the airfield, it was a grass airfield, and they'd run out of fuel. So then, on occasions, one would jump in a gharry, take the lorry out, earn some rope and pull it off the field.
Oh, and there quite often times I was driving this Bowser full of fuel around, with bombs dropping all around. But I was doing no more than all the rest who were working out there, you see. I don't quite know how to put it, because you didn't realise what was going on. You was busy. Sometimes you waited and they didn't come back. Sometimes your plane came back, but you saw others waiting and theirs didn't come back. Fortunately, although planes didn't come back, quite often pilots did. In fact, at one time, we was passing Elm Park underground station, and two of our pilots came out of the station with their parachutes tucked under their arm. They'd come back from a sortie by underground. We knew, for a start, that we were fighting for our life. Individually, the country was fighting for its life, and that plane had to be got up as soon as possible, and just what we did.
The Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Peter Harding, accompanying the Queen and also having much to recall himself as he chats with the veterans. And amongst them a group of Australians who last night were taken to a party by London taxi drivers who refused to accept their fare when they discovered who their clients were. Polite conversation and many an amusing tale to be told. But what did it really feel like to be a pilot in the Battle of Britain?
How did you feel when you saw your first enemy airplane?
Very confused. We went into a crowd of bombers and it was just chaos as far as I was concerned. I did all the right things, I think. I sort of put the gun button onto fire. I pressed the thing at the right time. Whether I hit anything, goodness only knows. But that was it. And, well, of course, if you had any sense, you didn't hang around after that.
Can you remember what you felt when you saw your first 109?
Oh, you know, for chaps like me, we were all the same. It was terribly exciting, really terribly exciting.
It must have occurred to you that you might be the next to be killed.
Oh yes, the thought certainly did cross my mind more than once, yes.
But it didn't bother you unduly?
No, it didn't. I think the time when one was really apprehensive was coming down to the airfield just at dawn or just before dawn, and you could smell the new mown grass on the airfield, you know, and you wondered if it was going to be, you'd see the next morning.
Yes, yes.
These thoughts certainly cross one's mind, naturally.
I don't think it was typical, but there was, in fact, a factual occasion, as it might be, this mess we're standing in front of now it was at Croydon, I believe, 2 young pilots turned up in a motor car, greeted by the CO, "Come on, we're at readiness, off you go." And they went up and they were both killed, and the car was left there. That was their sole participation. It lasted perhaps less than an hour.
You lost a lot of friends.
I did. We lost 10 pilots on the squadron in the 2 months, all good friends. Some I'd known for several months in the squadron, some joined us, we met for a week and then they'd gone. It was that sort of thing. Others stayed on.
How did you feel about the Germans?
I've been asked this question since the war on many occasions, and I think in our youth we looked upon this as a job to do. I don't think we ever thought of the individual in the aircraft at all. It was an enemy airplane to be shot at.
It's very hard for the average youngster today to realize that the quiet old man he sees was a very angry young man in 1940, because we hadn't asked these Germans to come over and bomb our folk. They were doing it. I mean, it's all very well to compare a place like Coventry with Dresden or something, but bear in mind this fact that you'd be surprised how much aggression would be generated from within the average man. If your mother, in my case, was being bombed by a lot of people who you hadn't asked to come and do it, and you began to be a very tough young man.
What do you reckon was your closest call?
Well, I had several. I was foolish enough to stay up alone when I should have come home. And I found myself at the end of what I thought was a loose line of about 27 Messerschmitts. And I had, I think there's a Walter Mitty in all of us, and I envisaged myself working down the line, and I'd forgotten number 28, who got me, and I was very badly shot up indeed.
Did you bail out?
No, I was able to get it back, but as I landed, the rudder controls went completely.
Where did you land?
I landed back at Biggin Hill.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Wheels up?
Oh, no, got my wheels down,
up?
yes. Couldn't
Gosh.
operate my flaps, and my port aileron had been blown off, and my canopy had gone, and my rear view mirror, and big holes in the airplane all over the place.
Yes, you must have been a bit twitched by that one.
I was a bit upset by it, yes.
Did you think that some of the British pilots took the whole thing a bit casually?
Well, I wouldn't say casually, but a little bit differently. When we came here, we had sort of experience of dealing with Germans. And although we didn't mind Germans, we hated Germany.
Some treat it as a sort of a sporting event, usually, especially auxiliary ones. There are quite a number of them. But I was lucky to be with Paddy Finnegan in the same squadron in '65. And he took it very seriously, and we had a long chat with him, and he told me, "Look, Ski, there never must be another war, because that doesn't solve the problem." And I entirely agreed. And I said to him, "Yes, but let's have Poland free first."
50 years ago, these young men were caught up on the relentless tide of history. But did they realize it at the time?
Did you ever have any doubts about the issue?
We never thought we'd be beaten, and I think we thought it might have gone on a bit longer. But the Battle of Britain as such, it stopped. We didn't win anything. Don't think we won any battle. But we did buy time, a little valuable time, which enabled our bomber command to get geared up. It enabled the army to start getting to grips, enabled the navies to get going. If we hadn't won that air battle, don't forget it's the only time in history 2 air fleets have ever met each other, when the change of a whole war happened. If we'd lost that air battle, I think you could have said the world would be a different place today.
What about you yourself? Were you confident of victory?
I think, yes, I think we were. I think in those days there was a lot of red on the map, wasn't there? There was a British Empire and so on, and ignorance, arrogance, call it what you like. Although things were rough, things were bad, I don't think anyone ever thought we'd lose.
The Battle of Britain was just as important as the Battle of Waterloo and the Battle of Trafalgar, and indeed of the fight against the Spanish Armada, in that it saved this country from invasion. And had we lost that, God knows what sort of a state we'd be in today.
Did you realize that it was a very important phase, the Battle of Britain?
At the time, no, and I don't think most of us realized how important this was. And as it's proved in the event, if we'd have lost that battle, that would have been the end of the war as far as we were concerned. There wouldn't have been any Montgomerys or Eisenhowers or anybody. That was the end.
Were you ever in doubt about the outcome?
No, strangely enough, one had no idea how we were going to win the war, of course, but there's one thing we were all convinced about, was that we weren't going to lose it.
Yes.
That would be the next phase, winning it.
Yes.
Thus the recollections being exchanged. The Duke of Edinburgh himself, of course, an airman in every sense of the word, enjoying the conversation with the Polish veteran from whom we just heard. But I think the time is approaching when, reluctantly perhaps, Her Majesty must leave her friends in that enclosure to continue the formalities of the parade. And so the Queen and Prince Philip, escorted by Sir Peter Harding and the Air Equerry, Wing Commander David Walker, proceed to the saluting base in the center gate of the palace in readiness for the march past. Meantime, as you see, the forecourt and the entrance to the palace, a few moments ago so crowded, is now vacant because the parade has withdrawn to the side in order to reform for the march past as spectacular as anything which we have seen so far today. The Queen approaches the podium on which she will stand alone, the focal point of these thousands of eyes gathered on this brilliant summer morning here in London. Sir Peter Harding on the Queen's left, the equerry behind, the Duke of Edinburgh to her right. The Queen looking to her left, from which she knows she will catch her first glimpse of what will be one of the most moving and proud moments of this entire occasion. There it is, the lone and erect figure of Air Chief Marshal Sir Christopher Foxley Norris, chairman of the Battle of Britain Fighter Association, followed by its Honorary Secretary, Wing Commander Pat Hancock, leads the marching contingent of veterans of the Battle of Britain, which in turn and alone leads the entire parade. Sir Christopher, a truly great chap. Swept into the very start of the war from Oxford University Air Squadron, flew Lysander in France, escaped near Dunkirk, went on to a brilliant service career and subsequently in business. Chairman for many years of the Leonard Cheshire Foundation, as modest, witty and entertaining a companion as one could ever meet. Behind him, those of his kind, who a half-century ago performed great deeds, though they will deny it, but who are proud and thankful to be here today, and that they will not deny. Moments never to be forgotten, not only by those whom we have just seen march past, but all those who watched and mentally at least saluted them. And now the parade commander, Group Captain Joe French, leads the march past of the squadrons, contingents and units already reviewed by Her Majesty, headed by their colours and standards and their escorts in a royal salute to the Sovereign from the Royal Air Force of today and of 50 years ago. And finally, the unarmed flights, the Women's Royal Air Forces, and finally behind them, what is described as the representatives contingent, all those organizations other than the Royal Air Force themselves, invited here in recognition of the part they played in the national effort. For example, the police, the ambulance service and the firemen, the Coastal Forces Veterans Association, the Salvation Army, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, who rescued so many downed airmen, and the Air Transport Auxiliary, who ferried in the replacement aircraft to the depleted squadrons. So this historic parade is dispersed, but the Royal Guard of Honour, the Queen's Colour Squadron, has reformed in the forecourt in readiness for the departure of Her Majesty. Thus ends a momentous occasion for the Royal Air Force, dedicated as it was to the most momentous period in its entire history. And dare one suppose that this great occasion may have won the approval even of those commanders of Iron Reserve, Lord Trenchard and Lord Dowding, without whom, as history reveals, the Battle of Britain may never even have been fought.
The commentator was Raymond Baxter and television presentation was by David Pickthall.